Okay, we are good with live stream. And Anvesha, once we open up the room, you can leave the poster on for maybe 30 seconds more, and then we can just take that down. I'll admit participants into the space now. Hello, everyone. Good day. Welcome to our online event in search of a movement, reflections on the climate justice movement in India. Thank you for joining us, and we are going to get started in just a few seconds. In the meantime, a few housekeeping announcements. Please ensure to keep your microphone on mute unless you're speaking. You can change the view that is available to you on the Zoom interface on the upper right corner of your screen. You can switch between an speaker view or a gallery view. We will be using the chat, and you'll find the chat function at the lower panel, usually of your Zoom interface. During our session, we'll have comments from our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. And then we will hopefully have a vibrant discussion with questions and answers. And we request you to use the chat function to allow for those questions to be collected during the course of the event. The broad format for the event is about 55 minutes of comments, followed by about 35 minutes of Q&A and discussion. We will be going on until 7:30 p.m. India time. My name is Abhairaj Nayak. I am one of the co-organizers of this event on behalf of the National Alliance for Climate and Ecological Justice, which is a part of the National Alliance of People's Movements, a relatively young alliance that has been brought together specifically to address the urgency and severity of the ecological and climate justice crisis that we are all encountering. Today, we have a wonderful panel with us. Our panelists are Bhargavi Rao, Disha Ravi, Nagaraj Adve, and Prakash Kashwan. Each one of them is an exemplar with bios that could keep me on screen for very many minutes, if not hours. I'm not going to give you the long bio to each one of them, except to say that I have encountered their work in the environmental and climate justice space on numerous occasions. Bhargavi is someone I started my career as an environmental activist with about 20 years ago. And she's an educator, a researcher, and a community engagement leader, and has been actively involved with a large number of campaigns across the country and in other parts of the world. Disha Ravi is inspiring youth climate activist leader, a researcher, a communicator par excellence, and somebody who really is bringing a wonderful blend of courage and creativity to India's climate justice movement, and is someone who also has provided a lot of inspiration and support to me as I think through what needs to be done in the climate justice space in India, and particularly in Bangalore, which is a city that we both call home. Nagaraj Adve has been a keen observer of the climate and environmental space for many decades now, a writer, a journalist, also a community builder. He is one of the mainstays of the Teachers Against Climate Crisis group that responds to the climate crisis through both education as well as advocacy and engagement in both academic and popular fora. And finally, Prakash Kashwan, who is somebody whose work has provided much needed resourcing for very many environmental justice and climate justice teachers and practitioners in India. I know that his collected the volume that he's edited called Climate Justice in India features in courses that I offer on the subject each time round. And his observations and insights really contribute to a nuanced and critical engagement both with the history as well as the politics of the larger environmental justice movement. So we are really set for a cracker of a discussion today. And without any further ado, I want to just, in a couple of minutes, frame how this um, event came about, right? As a recent member of the National Alliance for Climate and Ecological Justice in India, I realized that many within that alliance were keen, like me, to have a sense of the field and to better understand what exactly is it when we say that we are part of movement culture related to environment and justice in India. And starting my career as a young environmental activist with the organization Environment Support Group in Bangalore about 20 years back, I realized that the infighting and the differences within the environmental activists was almost as formidable as the challenges that the environmental movement had to encounter, right? And this was something that stayed with me then, and I've noticed that it continues even today. That is, there is a lot of fragmentation and contestation and occasional outright conflict between factions within the environmental cause. And so, like many others, we're interested in the question of what, if anything, constitutes the climate justice movement in India, right? What is its core? What allows for one to say that this is common? And how can we speak about movements such as the independence movement or the labor movement, or even the more recent environmental and climate activism movements, particularly in the wake of Greta Thunberg and American activism leading up to the election of Biden, in the same breath as what is happening in the climate movement space in India, right? How does one really begin to lean into the elements that constitute the movement? What are its edges? What are its points of tension? What is its history? And how can we, as young and old participants in this movement, make sense of this journey we are on together, right? So it was that broad field of questions that led to me quite often asking for answers to these questions from participants I encountered. And after several times of me raising these questions, our colleague Meera said, Abhay, you really need to organize an event to allow for a group think to surface this wisdom that's undoubtedly there within us, right? And this is the result of that activity. It is something that Rajesh and I have been thinking about for many, many weeks now. And we hope that in and through this session, we get some, if not all, the answers that we are looking for. All right, so that just a little bit of a frame. I think we'd love to now hear from our wonderful panelists, and we'll go in the order of Bhargavi, Disha, Nagraj, and Prakash. I welcome you to offer your opening comments on the broad theme of the climate justice movement in India. Bhargavi, I'll turn it over to you, and you can get us started off.
Thank you, Abhay, for the lovely introduction and the kind introduction to each of us. Uh, to those of you who can't hear me, I'm sorry, my laptop is, not playing good today, so I'll try and scream and put my face as close as possible. Uh, so, namaste, adab, jai bhim to everybody. Good evening. So, I would like to start with the fact that, climate justice starts with access to land. And this is something that even the IPCC reports have been saying, continuously saying land tenure security is very important. But in the context of India, what we are seeing right now, and all of us know here since the NAPCC was formed, the solar mission is one which is like really doing very well in the context of building all the solar parks. But this particular solution is coming at a huge cost of land and livelihoods. The way land is being grabbed is something that we all need to be very worried about, because it is not just the commons that are going. When I say commons, it is the sacred groves, it is the grasslands, it is forests, it is patches of land that have very weak regulation. And on top of it, we are also appropriating a whole lot of private land, agricultural land. And these are lands that are coming from the poorest of the poor, the small and marginal farmers. And it is like, that's the only thing they have, and that's the only skill they have, the agro-pastoral work. And all of us know here that these communities don't just do one thing in a year, they do a bunch of things that help them survive. And they're also very conscious about whether it is a grassland or a sacred forest or anything else. They don't exploit it like anybody else, right? So they use it in a very judicious way. But once land is taken away from them, they don't know anything else. So, how is land being taken for all the solar and wind and other projects? That is something that is again very worrying, because despite the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 being amended in 2010, 2013, 2015, that law is largely put in cold storage. No state has picked it up. There is no uptake of the provisions of those, the key provisions of the amendments in the state laws. The State Land Reforms Act are largely determined by the industrial policies and mostly the renewable energy policies. So renewable energy policies today are largely influencing how land can be, appropriated. So how is land being taken? Land is, like I said, very, if I may use the word, cunningly being taken away from the local communities. So one is the lease method, in which people are being told, oh, the land will be in your name, you're not going to lose anything, you're going to get a compensation for it. But the lease amount is not something that the local communities have been able to negotiate. It is a fixed amount that was set at 21,000 rupees when Pavagada came up. Now it is 31,000 rupees when Koppal and newer plants are coming up. And the second method is the direct purchase, where the solar power developers are purchasing it directly from the farmers, from the small and marginal farmers. And the way they are buying it is also very interesting, because they have pushed people of the village as brokers. So people known to these villagers are coming and luring them to part with their land. And this is something I have seen in Koppal, I have seen in Chamrajnagar, where they loiter around in near alcohol shops where men are drinking themselves to death, and push them to sell their land at some very low prices. And they're also threatened that if you don't sell the land today, tomorrow the government will take the land away from you, so you better sell it to us. So that's how land is being appropriated, the second way. The third one is what we saw in Mikir Bamuni in Nagaon district of Assam, where they used violence and took away grant land that was given to the local communities. And a standing crop of paddy was bulldozed to set up the solar park. So this is how land is being taken away. And we all know that, it was removed from the purview of environmental clearances, and that is MOF and CC has held on to that position despite an NGT order, where it had said in 2013 that MOEFCC has to go revisit this decision. And also that decision has been an office memorandum. It has not been a formal, proper document, an office memorandum which continues to say that, all renewable energy projects don't require EIA processes. So what is happening is, with this kind of sale and loss of access to land, the livelihoods are gone. There is distress sale of animals. They don't know what to do, and most people are migrating. And with migration comes a whole lot of problem. One is the youth and able-bodied people are migrating out. Girl children are being pulled out of school. There is increased child marriage. There is increased, these children don't have nutrition at the household level. Even with 1 acre of land, our farmers, Abhay, let me know if I'm crossing the time. Even with 1 acre of land, people know how to feed themselves. But once the land is taken away, there isn't enough food at the household level. The girl children are not ready for a reproductive life cycle. Maternal mortality and infant mortality have increased. Kopal has been reporting this. All news channels have been reporting this. And this is a new problem that we are seeing, and a problem that India has been working for the last 75 odd years to fix maternal mortality and infant mortality. But with these numbers increasing, it is very grave. And this is not just local reports. Even the local FAO studies showed that women in South Asia are more with as a medical health issues. Then the recent global hunger index report has also put India under a serious category, which is something that we should all be concerned about. So, in this context, these people who are migrating into cities, we are seeing what is happening. They get into the gig economy. The cities that are receiving these migrants are not ready for, providing them a decent job, decent housing, decent access to healthcare, education, none of that. And we are seeing in Bangalore, the migrants are further affected by climate change. While they may have sold their land because there was no rain, or it was flooded like in Odisha, here they come and they settle in places where the entire settlement is flooded in a city like Bangalore, and they can't get to work. Their days are marked as leave, and what little saving they have, they give it to a private doctor. They can't afford to go to a public health center because, one, it is very far away, not accessible, etc., etc. Then their children can't access school. They live in very, very sad conditions. There was a study done about a year back, which about slums in Bangalore where migrant workers are living, and that study was, although it was just a dipstick study, it just shows us the quality of life that they are subjected to. So
Bhargavi, maybe you can slowly start wrapping up your opening comments.
yes. So this is what is happening in areas where large scale solar parks are coming. And another problem is the fact that we are not prepared for, because all these are leases of 28 years. We are not prepared for the solar PV waste that will come up, and the local communities who are now bearing the brunt of having losing their land. It is the senior citizens who are residing there. 28 years from now, it will be these communities who will be facing the toxic impacts of all the PV related stuff. That is another important thing we should be concerned about. And the third one is the ecological impacts. Way back when we fought in 2012-13, the first solar park that was coming up in central Karnataka, there itself, it was the habitat of the great Indian bustard. And one of the directions by the NGT was that the state come out with a state action plan for GIBs. Karnataka did not do anything about it. Karnataka today has just one or two in Siruguppa areas. Andhra Pradesh and Telangana regions don't have any. So that's another concern, not just with GIBs, but there are a whole lot of other flora and fauna like the black buck and others. And we're also losing our Deccani sheep, and the Amrit Mahal cattle is almost gone now, just a small number that is left. And India being the largest producer of meat and milk, and with a large number of people in pastoralism, without livelihood for them, without a place of access for their livelihood, the way solar parks are coming up is something that we should be worried about. In the next round, I will share a little more. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Bhargavi, for getting us started off with a close appreciation of what is happening with the land and related to the land. I think that's an important ethical stance also with regard to our discussion on climate justice, to really relate it to the bodies and lives that are at the cutting edge of the impacts. And we look forward to hearing more about some of these stories that you have just given us a sort of a sneak peek into. May I invite Disha to perhaps offer some opening comments next?
Thank you, Abhay. That's very hard to follow. I think Bhargavi like really set the tone of how impressive the work is, and just how connected the climate movement is. Um, I actually wanted to shed some light on what the Indian climate movement has been up to. I think this year, especially now, we are seeing just how bad the climate crisis is. We've always known this. We've always experienced the worst of it. If you're in Delhi, like people are breathing the most toxic air possible. Um, but it's not just a Delhi issue, it's a countrywide issue where even in Bangalore, where I reside, our AQI has been about 300, 200 sometimes, which is still unhealthy. It's not as bad as Delhi, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it is indeed bad. And what I'm getting to is that we've had so many calamities this year that is so interlinked with the climate crisis that when it's not as bad, we've really just um, normalized it, saying like, oh, at least it wasn't as bad as say Delhi, or it wasn't as bad as like that region where people died. And I feel like that's something I don't want to happen going forward. That no matter what injustice, no matter how small it is, it shouldn't be acceptable. And I think that's something the youth movement really focused on this year, where we sought to highlight the lived realities of not just the worst of what the country had to see, but also like the minor injustices. I want to start off with some campaigns like that we did in our like own city that even NAPM was involved in. Um, and one of the things that really showed a lot of resilience and beauty for me was in Honavar, where in my own state of Karnataka, in Uttara Kannada, where fishing communities have a very deep relationship with the ocean, and they've lived there for like decades. And there's a port being built, and there have been protests going on for decades at this point. But what was really like touching for me to see is how like youth movements like Fridays for Future Karnataka itself, but also other lots of other movements, older and younger, including NAPM, worked along with the community to map out what the issue is, to understand how the port is going to harm the local ecosystems and the local fishing communities, and understand why this is bad. And I'm starting off with this story to also highlight what Bhargavi said, that climate justice is very interlinked with land and how who gets ownership of that land. But we really need to be moving away from the concept of ownership to responsibility, like not just about who is like the owner of this land, but who is responsible for taking care of this land, who is responsible for ensuring that this land um, is able to be passed down to the next generation, to be able to yield fruit for just as it did for us. It is a responsibility that we have to the future generations to ensure that we maintain that land in a way that is beautiful and that is preserved, and that is in then we don't take more than the earth, what the earth has to offer. And I think we've really done that to we've been trying to highlight the importance of that. And I wanted to talk about how this wasn't necessarily in the abstract, and this wasn't just in Honavar. And this we've been doing a lot of work across the country as well. Another thing that is going on at the moment in Karnataka itself. Sorry, I'm going to talk a lot about my own state because it is my state at the end of the day. Um, there's a Padyatra going on in Nagarhole by the Jainu Kuruba community, who have been fighting again for their land rights for a really long time. Um, and this has been the case since the 1970s, since they started facing trouble on a land that they essentially lived off of for years and they took care of, which was later converted into a tiger reserve. And in the 1990s, they were essentially evicted from their own land, and something that they continue to fight. Before, there were hundreds of people on that land, and now there are hardly like 30 families there. Um, and they're doing a Padyatra to essentially highlight the importance of their relationship with land, but also to get their own land back. And this is, I think, an important story in the importance of like land and forest governance, and how it should be a collaboration with the state as well as the communities. Because yes, conservation is important, but conservation cannot happen without the people who are like the most indigenous to the land, because studies have shown how indigenous people themselves nourish the land. And I think that's really important. And if you can join the Nagahare Padayatra, please go and check out. It's on like different pages on FF Karnataka as well. And it's really important that we support them. In the more urban side of things, in Bombay, I think the Save RA movement has once again remained a key reference point. But as not just as a past victory, but as an ongoing warning. I think youth groups have repeatedly drawn lessons from RA as a metro, a road, a real estate project, and they've continued to target urban green spaces across Indian city, often with environmental clearances pushed through with very minimal scrutiny. Um, and this is something that a lot of work has been going on. There's been a lot of like push against fossil fuels, especially opposing mines, in places like Chhattisgarh, Odisha, which I know NAPM has been really involved in, and even Jharkhand. Um, and I think it's important to note when you're reflecting on how the year has been that, we've moved beyond just protests and slogans, and those are really important things. But we've become more strategic into how we can actually get to the end goal and how we can engage with policymakers and decision makers, to oppose corporate beneficiaries, to highlight the fact that this is not just going to harm the community in the short run, but also in the long run. And there are zero benefits to it today and tomorrow for like new coal mines, or new mining projects in general. And I think that was a really good shift for us, because we are also focusing on how, as India, we need to be moving away from fossil fuels and what that looks like on a very community level, on what that looks like for workers who work in these industries, because they also have to deal with like the pollution that comes from having to survive in these industries. And I think that was a very good that was a very good highlight. And I think one of the other, unfortunately, highlights of the year was the fact that it was one of the hottest years we've ever experienced. I know it feels like such a long time ago, because now it's so cold and we're all freezing. Um, but I think if you remember in March, April, heat was a central topic of discussion, and rightfully so, because of how horrible it was and because of how extreme heat impacted outdoor workers, students, and informal laborers, especially in the north and central of India. But it also
Disha,
took.
sorry, may I request you to slowly start wrapping up your opening comments? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Abhay. And how that essentially it was a part of South India also, where we also faced heat waves. And air pollution is also something that is ongoing. The point is, at the end of the day, we have been shifting to center more voices on ground. We have been shifting to engage decision makers in how we can actually get to the end outcome. And we have been highlighting who are the most impacted of all these calamities, and how we can actually get solutions, and how those solutions can be implemented on a very grassroots level. And I would say that is a great shift in the movement space, where we're moving towards what we can actually do. Um, so yeah, while we've had a very shocking year, we've also had a year where we've come together, and I think that's really important and something we should also celebrate, of that unity and that solidarity between people. Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Disha. And I think maybe if I had to choose one more webinar topic to really generate interest and attention on, it would be this question of what can environmentalists learn from youth movements, particularly in the climate space. I see constantly this intergenerational tension, but also some paradoxes around who knows what, and how should we attempt to unlock sets of possibilities. And I think many friends have also begun to problematize this and write about it in terms of how do the new youth movements, quite often which are just characterized often as being digital movements, How do they connect with older movements around forest livelihoods, also labor and worker rights, etc., particularly in India? Thank you for those great updates and insights as to what's going on. Before we move to Nagra, just a request to friends to please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to see who's in the room. And this is a chance to do a little bit of movement building, albeit in a very synoptic way in the chat space. Also, questions and comments, please do add them directly into the chat, even as our speakers are sharing. This will be useful for us to have some collection at the latter part of the session today when we get into a deep dive onto specific questions that are raised. Over to you, Nagraj.
Yeah, thank you, Abhiraj. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
you're
okay.
coming through good. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So, broadly, I feel there's a kind of twofold background or context for discussing the notion of a climate justice movement in India. So the first is specific to climate change and relevant for any climate movement or politics, which is the recent acceleration in the rate of warming. So globally, the planet was warming at, as we know, less than zero point 0.2 degrees per decade for over half a century. Has suddenly shot up in the last few years to over 3 degrees Celsius. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that I think this changes almost everything that we activists had thought of earlier, the assumptions we made, and also most importantly, relevant to this particular conversation, what our strategies ought to be. Now, in India, this acceleration is masked partly by air pollution and partly by irrigation, etc., but it is still worsening fast and will accelerate in the very near future. That's one context. The second context, I think, applies to any movement and not just to the climate movement, which is a relative decline of the left, both the mainstream left and the far left, and the systemic weakening of the labor movement over the last maybe 25 or 30 years because of the contractualization and informalization of workers and so on. Now, both these factors influence, I think, any climate work that we do in India. Uh, there are, I think, broadly at least three aspects to climate justice in Indian context, and I mean climate justice from below. So, one at the core of climate justice is the not just the notion, but the empirically proven reality that those least responsible for global warming have been facing as brunt the most, as some speakers have already mentioned. I've been doing so for years, and this is rooted in structural inequalities around class, gender, etc. Two, the second aspect is that the energy transition must be just, which in particular pertains to, I think, as Disha just mentioned, cushioning its impacts on millions of workers in coal mines, older coal plants, and not just that, but also entire occupations, townships that rose in central India and eastern India around the coal economy. And then besides that, there also is the transport sector. There are lakhs of workers in auto parts factories not far from where I live in Delhi, in Gurgaon and Faridabad, who will soon be impacted by the shift from the internal combustion engine to the batteries. So the entire notion of justice and the transition for these, we now talk of millions of workers, requires planning decades ahead. Because we can't just assume that existing coal workers in central India can be sort of deployed in solar parks in Gujarat, etc. A third aspect of climate justice, I think Bhargavi has already well touched upon, is how it impacts marginal farmers and other communities because simply sort of generating 1 megawatt of solar power takes about 5 acres of land, like she's already discussed, so I won't get into it. One issue I suggest we discuss today is whether these various facets of climate justice, and they may well be more, or the lack of justice and transgression, are there degrees of importance between them, and whether a violation of one is greater or more severe a climate injustice than the other, and if so, whether in that sense the climate movement ought to be prioritizing one area over the other is something I think we should think about and discuss. And perhaps in this context, those impacted is perhaps the most weighty simply because their numbers are massive and in every region and town in the country and place in the country. In this context, I'd like to sort of touch upon, which I may expand later. One of the more encouraging developments in the last couple of years is how actually climate impacts, and in particular, extreme heat on working people, has received the attention, I think, of a lot of organizations that work with workers, and not just unions, NGOs, other collectives, etc. And this is something that sort of got catalyzed, I think, particularly in 2024. And this is not just factory workers, but even more so informal workers, home-based workers, women, waste workers, hawkers, etc., through such collectives. It was catalyzed by this incredible crazy heat that we experienced in North India in 2024, but also well elsewhere, which connects to the acceleration in warming that I first mentioned. In that sense, through all those, one got a sense of the formation of a movement that an extremely crucial social group working in a highly informal economy was engaging far deeper with the climate crisis simply because their mass base was being impacted by that extreme heat. Now, one thing that the climate movement ought to consider, and this is one challenge for the climate justice movement, is the fact that we are facing not a static problem, but a moving target. And that I think is not sufficiently appreciated by all of us who sort of engage with the climate movement. Warming, in a sense, is going to intensify going forward. Globally, 2000, it's going to be extremely hard. It's not a static thing. And I think the movement so far has been largely reactive and needs to think in the longer term. By longer term, I think I'm talking of at least a few years, 5 years, 10 years, etc. That's one challenge. The second challenge is the lack of robust information regarding key impacts. For instance, again, talking of extreme heat, let's take deaths from heat stress. All right. Now, some work suggests that the mortality from heat stress has declined ever since the heat action plans have been in operation for the last decade or so, and that may well be true. However, studies elsewhere have shown that just this year in parts of Europe, 16,500 people died from extreme heat and died connected to climate change. I'm not talking of heat in general, but climate change alone, heat alone. Other studies have shown that in 2023, not that long ago, 61,000 people died in just four countries in Europe, in a region that had a total population of 543 million. So we're talking about a population that's about 40% India's, and 61,000 people died. We just don't have that kind of data in India. And generally, studies show that the deaths happen as much where people live as much as their workplace. In fact, more where people live because they live in the areas which are extremely dense and so on, in bastis and jugis and so on. A third challenge for the climate movement, I feel, is the absence of a mitigation strategy. I feel we've got a greater clarity on adaptation, but I feel that a movement needs to be have a reasonably unified strategy. And I feel if we need to call it a movement, then we need such a strategy. Adaptation may not need one because it's very region specific, context specific, but mitigation needs one. And I think we do not have a robust mitigation strategy as yet on which we are campaigning. And in this context, I would say that we need to also focus on limiting demand, particularly by the rich, and not just the question of limiting supply of fossil fuel use, etc. Finally, just 2 points. In the context of the recent shocking dilution of the NREGA, I would think that we in the climate movement should join any social forces or unions that are campaigning against this dilution of the NREGA because the NREGA has simply huge potential and it's shown that it has benefits for climate impacts, cushioning impacts, climate adaptation, whether it is the digging of ponds, whether it's making other kinds of structures in rural areas. In fact, I have for a while been arguing that we should be campaigning for an NREG in urban areas because it has a huge potential in areas like urban housing for the poor, questions of a more equitable water distribution in urban areas. And obviously, it has a capacity to generate jobs in cities, which is the other great crisis, the question of employment. Finally, I would say that, I think what Vidisha just touched upon, which is the movement needs to possibly reflect on why is it that the issue of air pollution has gained so much traction in recent weeks, unlike perhaps the issue of global warming adequately, notwithstanding what I said. Now, that could be because the upper middle class is more agitated about pollution because they can see its effects on themselves, on their family, on their kids, etc. Whereas perhaps climate change seems too distant, too abstract, etc. Whereas actually not the case. It's very much located in people's lives. Maybe they feel that their wealth can cushion them from the worst impacts of global warming, like just installing air conditioners. But and perhaps and with air pollution, one sort of addresses the government directly. And I think one needs to think of this sort of contrast between these two massive issues, which are sort of deep crisis, and perhaps maybe the climate movement and the air pollution campaign, people need to get together and perhaps merge the two issues because they have much overlap precisely in common roots and both are very deeply, very grave public health concerns. So maybe those are the sort of issues that maybe the climate justice movement can think about going forward in order to expand. But let's not forget that it's not a static problem. It's something that's going to intensify in the years going ahead. And we in the movement need to sort of internalize that to be able to cope. Yeah, thank you. I'll just end there. And
Thank you so much, Nagaraj. Lots of food for thought there. Particularly, I deeply appreciate, of course, the uh, front staging of the structural decline, let's say, of the left and of labor movements in India. And I think this question of the science around global warming and how things are in a way of a vocabulary that we haven't seen before, and one must acknowledge that, is, I think, so important for many of us within the movement who sort of seem to repackage responses in light of what has come before, right? Maybe there is something that requires a new way of talking and imagining where we as residents on this planet are going to. And of course, I think many other points around heat and mitigation strategy, etc., that I hope we come back to. Let me now please invite Prakash to offer opening comments, and colleagues in the audience are encouraged to please share your questions and comments in the chat as we go along, so we have a good collection of them. Over to you, Prakash.
Thank you, Abhay. Delighted to be part of this really inspiring panel. And thank you to my co-panelists for their insightful comments earlier. So I was trying to set up a QR code. I'll make reference to several kinds of resources, articles, and so forth. And so if you can actually scan this QR code right now, this will bring you to a page where I've listed some of the things, and I'll put on other things that I may mention during these comments. And the other thing I want to start by adding on is that on this panel, probably I'm the only one who identifies himself as not being directly engaged in the debates around the practices of social movements and climate movements in India. And I say that because it's also an open question as to what the role of an academic should be in the context of a social movement, and especially in the context of a justice movement. The third thing is that, I will assume that vocabulary can be confusing, and so sometimes maybe I'll explain things a bit more than seems reasonable, so please bear with me. I want to start by talking about this idea that there are two separate movements, climate movement and climate justice movement. And oftentimes, people can sometimes use these two movements in a sort of overlapping way. And in my work, I've made a clear distinction between a climate movement and a climate justice movement. And I argue, so there's an article on the webpage that I showed you earlier. It's called Climate Justice in the Global North, an introduction. And this was written for the students to clarify some things. So the conflation of climate movement with climate justice movement has led to three pitfalls or blind spots. One is that a lot of the discussion is post hoc. So we are taking climate crisis as given, and then we are arguing that climate crisis is disproportionately impacting the marginalized group, which is absolutely true. But that also leads us to believe that because that's the case, the more radical climate action you take, for example, declaration of climate emergency is considered to be a very radical step, that it's going to be most beneficial for the marginalized people. And that's a paradox, because the impact of climate change are certainly borne by the most
Do your physics
marginalized.
first, then we'll sit and do this together.
But once you reverse it, once you try to address climate crisis, the impact of the policies of climate response will also be disproportionately affecting some of the marginalized group, as we have seen in the examples that Bhargavi and Disha and Nagaraj all talked about. But remembering that conceptual distinction is really important, because we can't assume that the most radical ways of addressing climate crisis will lead to climate justice by itself. And so we need to sort of keep thinking about that. And finally, as Disha pointed out, that there's a lot more effort now on the part of the movements to sort of think about, so what are the action points for achieving climate justice? That's one thing. The other point that I want to bring in, and we can, sort of, these are complex issues, we can definitely talk more about it in the second round and so forth. The second point I want to make is that in the grassroots movement, there is a sort of a background of anarchism. And by anarchism, I mean a resistance to authority, particularly the authority of the state, and an assumption that decentralization of decision-making resources to the local level is going to create better outcomes. And social science research shows that those assumptions don't always hold true. And actually, for a deeply just outcome, we need a fair combination of the deployment of the authority of the state that is checked by many other actors, including social movements, opposition parties, accountable bureaucracy and judiciary and so forth, accountable state combined with accountable social movements. So that's something that's often not talked about, because social movements, especially in the context that we have seen in India for past 12 years almost, there's no sense that we can actually make use of the state, and that is taken away from the fact that there is no alternative to tapping into the authority of the state. And the third point is that when movements talk about grassroots power, we think of power in a very particular way. It's a sort of aspirational power, that if we decentralize, if the capitalist forces go away, then the grassroots movement will have power. But then that is absolutely the goal, right? To sort of take power away from the actors who are responsible for climate crisis, and bring power to the marginalized groups who are affected by climate impact. But for that to happen, we have to have a theory of change, and we have to have pathways leading step by step from the point where we are today in the present juncture. And so that requires a very careful analysis of the way in which politics and policymaking are entangled. And Nagaraj, rightly mentioned that there's been very little discussion of what our mitigation strategies should be in the climate justice movement. But if you think about the scholarship on climate action in India, you will come to believe that India is actually already doing very well compared to what is expected of it, because we have done solar and we have done a bunch of things so that we are even ahead of our goals in some ways and so forth. Now, that is a trap. That argument that India is already doing so well on climate action is a trap, because there's been very little public discussion of what those mitigation strategies should be. And if there's been no public discussion, somebody somewhere in closed doors have been deciding on the climate policies. And that has led to all the impact that Bhargavi and Disha mentioned and Nagaraj mentioned. So the point is to democratize policymaking itself, and that should also be part of the goal of climate justice movement in India. Although, of course, again, in the present context, it is extremely difficult to see how that might be achieved. But it's really always important to keep that in mind and keep organizing our power in a multi-level approach. And so one other article that I put in the on the page here that the QR code will take you to, we proposed a power matrix where we talk about, and this is the last point I'll make before stopping, how movements can actually deploy three different kinds of power. There's power of resource mobilization and power of wielding the authority of the state. That's first kind of power, which is the most commonly talked about type of power. And then you have the power of agenda setting, not just in terms of the narrative, which is a different power, that's the third form of power, but the actual policymaking agenda. And because India's climate policy making has been bureaucratized and technocratized. Um, Very few non-bureaucratic, non-technocratic actors have actually had any say in India's climate policy. And so we got to be intervening in shaping the climate policy agenda, both at the national level and the state level, to make sure that the concerns of marginalized groups are not brought as a reaction, as an afterthought after the climate policy has already been addressed. And that brings me back to the first point I made, that we can't assume that good, effective implementation of climate mitigation or climate adaptation policy is always going to produce just outcomes. And you can think about the crazy schemes of climate engineering and solar geoengineering that are already being talked about at very high levels. Those will have massively unjust effect on billions of people in South Asia and other parts of the global South. And the third part is the narrative power. And to some extent, mainstreaming of the recognition of indigenous wisdom and indigenous rights has been a successful narrative strategy. But we also know that powerful political and economic actors, they are extremely cunning and cynical in deploying the very narratives that we see as emancipatory and progressive narratives. They have already deployed those narratives in a way that is a form of greenwashing and rights washing and so forth. And so our goal has to be not give up on the goals and the values that we hold dear, but to make sure that we are not allowing scrupulous actors to appropriate those narratives and to then slide in phrases such as, nature-based solutions. Sounds good. And then you say, we will do rights-based, nature-based solution. Sounds even better, right? But what is the actual content of those rights-based, nature-based nature solution? And that also requires us to sort of deeply think about some of the frames of environmentalism and environmental movement that have become very popular. In the second round of my comments, I'll talk about this idea of environmentalism of the poor, environmentalism of the rich, and bourgeois environmentalism or environmentalism of middle class. And what do those categories tell us, and what do they imply for climate action and climate justice in India?
Thank you
I'll
so
stop.
much, Prakash. Thank you very much. I think really resonated with so many things you said, and just want to echo and resurface two of those points. One being the importance of having clarity on that theory of change, particularly the pathways that's going to get us from where we are to the alternatives we imagine and want, and what that means in terms of real lives and structures and processes that exist today. And two, I think the point about a clear articulation of what people's movements and people's movement representing organizations want in terms of our climate future. I notice Ashish is also in the room and has mentioned the need for a climate justice charter, for example, akin to what has happened in South Africa, as something that India could perhaps also benefit from. And that is definitely something that I hope we come back to in the second part of this event.
Right.
I'm going to take us to round two of comments. I must apologize for being a poor time manager. We are short of time, as usually happens with such sessions. And so the invitation to all four of you is to really channeling Buckminster Fuller, speak about what is really most important for us to speak about at this moment together, to limit yourself to one or two big points, and also to limit yourself to 5 minutes or less with your second round of comments. It would be great if you feel so inclined to allow us to move towards what do we do together as we now have a sense of at least an outline, the lay of the land with regard to the climate justice context for India. This time round, maybe Disha, I'd like to invite you to get us started off. Over to you.
Wait, Abhay, sorry, you cut off for me. Can you repeat that, please?
Sorry, I said we could perhaps start off with you this time with the second round of comments. And my proposal was that we limit ourselves to about 5 minutes or so with the second round of comments, since we're running out of time, and really emphasize one or two most important things that we, as uh, people in the movement or people who are interested in the movement, must be thinking, talking, and doing things about. So anything that comes with those prompts is welcome from you.
Thank you, Abhay. Um, I think one of the things that was highlighted throughout this talk, and that is very important for us to also acknowledge, is that I think as a movement, while there have been times where we've been really united, there have also been times where we didn't agree with each other. But the victories that I spoke about, or the resistance that we have displayed against like these corporate cronies, or even like the government that hasn't prioritized the people. And those victories only happened when we came together as a movement, when we put aside our differences, when we put aside like the way in which we want to do things, but we came together and used all those methods. And I think that is really important for us to do again. Um, because at the end of the day, I can understand that we all want the same thing. Like Prakash said, we want climate justice, but what does that look like? And sitting down and defining that is really important, but also setting aside our differences in how we will achieve it. Because there is often like this distance between like the youth movement and like the, I don't want to say older, but like the elders, I would say, um, in this space, um, who have put in an amazing work, uh, who do more on ground work, and there is often this like distance that we do more digital work. And while that is true to a degree, I think what makes us really powerful is when we combine those efforts, when we do both digital work, when we do work on the ground, and when we use creative methods of coming together. And I think that's something I hope we take away at the end of the year, that we do need that work on ground. We do need that social media work. We need those press conferences, but we also need those like weird reels that we do to like these trending audios on social media, because it's really important for us to use all the tools we have available to us to reach to that end goal. It's okay if we sometimes disagree on how to get there, as long as we continue working together. And I think that's something that I hope we take off more into the new year. Because at the end of the day, we are working against people who have all the resources in the world, who have all the money in the world, who have literally everything in their hand. And we, on the other hand, are pitched with like very little to almost, in some cases, no resources. Um, and we need to use everything we have. We need to use all the tools we have to get to our end goal, whatever that might be. In say Nagarhali, if that is getting helping the Jain Kurwa community getting forest rights, how are we going to do that? How are we going to work with the community to essentially get there? And I think that's something we really need to sit together and do. And also, I do
1 minute more, Disha.
Okay. And I also do believe it's an intergenerational responsibility thing. Um, because the climate crisis isn't something we necessarily created, but it isn't something that the ordinary man created at the end of the day. It didn't happen because one day I decided to use one plastic bottle. It happened because of fossil fuel companies. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the intergenerational responsibility we have, not just to the planet, but to each other, to address and solve this crisis and to get to climate justice. Thank you, Abhay. Back to you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for staying in time. And yeah, I think panelists, maybe it's now modified to about 4.5 minutes of sharing. Nagraj, over to you, please.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points so that there's enough time for a discussion. I think the audience should also come in, with their thoughts instead of us just speaking, but just make a couple of points. Well, see, for one, I feel that uh, we there's very large social groups. I feel the engagement with the climate crisis is still partial, notwithstanding what I was saying earlier. I mean, if you take, for instance, farmers' organizations, if you take large trade unions, or how they look at the energy transition, or even you take the women's movement, we're talking of three of the most important movements, or among the most important movement, among the more important movements in the country. There's not sufficient in-depth engagement with the climate crisis, despite a greater recognition that it is a crisis, right? So, how can we, as part of the climate justice movement, enable that greater engagement? What kind of interaction? What kind of resources, material, information, conversation, where there is a shared understanding of their reality, of, let's say, of the farmers have 10 issues on their plate, like the entire farm laws campaign over the last couple of years. How can also then that bring in ecological questions? I think that's one. Secondly, I would say that we need a more and here I might be repeating myself, a greater, a slightly longer term view of the last, maybe of the next 4 or 5, or maybe even longer, maybe 10 years, and think about issues of mitigation as well, and perhaps in this context intersect with the air pollution crisis, precisely because of the fact that they have common roots, and one can kind of address both issues sort of simultaneously, and it enables us, I think, to widen our audience, widen our issues, etc. One question here is that the air pollution campaigns tend to also reach out to the upper middle class. So how do we in the climate movement, how do we relate to the middle class and upper middle class is the question. There have been some trade union people, for example, Ashim Roy, who has been arguing that we need to actively reach out to the middle class and upper middle class regarding climate concerns as well. So that I think is something that perhaps the climate movement can also consider and in that sense discuss. So yeah, I mean these are I sort of more thoughts, but I really don't want to in that sense take too much time at the moment. But yeah, I think I'll just sort of stop there and leave to others to move forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Nagaraj. Hopefully, we'll have more to share with some of the responses to the questions that are beginning to pop up in the chat. Prakash, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. So continuing with the theme sort of I wanted to touch on. One, I'm assuming that there are some youth activists who've been, are relatively new to the climate movement, or there are many engineers and, natural sciences people for whom, the arguments of climate justice have filtered in through social media and such. So in that context, sometimes we notice there's a tendency that, you kind of essentialize poor people, you essentialize marginalized people, and that means that you create a monolithic category, and you sort of assume a lot of things about how that category is going to be behaving and what their interests are and how we can take care of those interests. And so the antidote to that problematic practice is to actually join the mass movements and grassroots movements who are building actual grassroots power, right? So it's not just assuming that we need to sort of bring awareness to marginalized people and then act on their behalf, but actually create empowered grassroots movement or join creating empowered grassroots movement, particularly under the current circumstances, may be extremely difficult, but join hands with, in Disha's vocabulary, the non-climate or pre-climate movements who've been fighting this for a very, very long time. So that's one thing. Second, I think it is also, my first degree was in sciences. I gradually moved to social sciences. And so over the years, I have taught myself a lot of social theory, a lot of political science, a lot of sociology. And the more I read, the more I realized that I didn't fully understand some things, right? And so I think there should also be study groups. This used to be an old leftist practice of creating study groups. And I think within the climate justice movement, especially within the youth movement, there's an opportunity to create study groups, and those of us who've been around for a long time, we can come in as maybe people who share some resources, but it should be a space for deliberation and creative disagreements and contestation and all of that. Without that, just accepting these frames of climate justice too readily can actually create a very superficial kind of understanding of what we are after overall. And finally, there is, especially again in the youth generation, and I also came out of a youth generation, so my definition of youth generation is quite extended. But we need to be critically thinking about what are the frames and assumptions that inform our thinking. How do we think about markets and state? And what is the relationship between market and state? And so I'm assuming again that there are many youth climate activists who have grown up sort of identifying themselves as liberal and liberal progressive and so forth. And so what is that framework of liberalism and liberal progressivism, and how does that differ from the good old Marxist or communist debates around these kinds of questions? So a lot more sort of churning around how we think about climate action, how we think about climate justice, how do those two connect together, and then how do we bring that understanding to bear on the movements that we are trying to support. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Prakash. Thank you for also doing that quickly for us. And Bhargavi, last but not least, over to you for your round two comments.
Yeah, thank you. It's been wonderful listening to all of you. I just want to remind us all, during it was the pandemic that kind of taught us that the solution finally lies very locally. So it was at your street level, your apartment level that, people got you food, people got you a bed in the hospital because they knew somebody, or the medicine came or whatever, and we all survived. So that's a lesson to strengthen and go back to fixing our governance, because in the context of climate change, we need to fix local governance, whether it is the 11th schedule or the 12th schedule. So a recent study in Bangalore done by one of the groups, it just shows that the provisions of the 12th schedule is what the local people are asking in the study. It is a survey. So if you fix the provisions of the 12th schedule, that particular neighborhood is largely prepared to address climate change related issues, whether it is flooding or heat or whatever, because that's exactly what they are asking. So drawing from that, again, going back to renewable energy installations, we have somehow sidelined the provisions of the 11th schedule. Non-conventional energy is a function of the panchayat. So if only we can go back to the drawing book and say, can our panchayats reimagine renewable energy? We have 268 odd panchayats in the country. And if each panchayat puts even 2 megawatt, your 500 gigawatts is met. And you don't have to be appropriating land like this, because today we are appropriating land, but read appropriation of land and handing it over to big corporations or the state, and then read it along with what is happening to Manrega. So you will have people who will be bonded laborers again. So in that context, I think going back to the 11th schedule and the 12th schedule is very important, and seeing where we can do what. So this is a new initiative that we have started with some people in Pavagada, where they said we'll start with raising awareness about all the legal provisions that there are in all the 34 panchayats in Pavagada. So, and moving on, something else that I'd like to highlight is many of our communities who live, who are struggling to make a life. For them, climate change, floods, heat, they're just dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. Some of these terms and terminologies don't really get into them. It is very sad. So in one of the workshops, I was just asking people, what do you know about climate change? Of course, I was talking to them in Kannada, and many young people raised their hand. And one young boy got up and said, it is because of climate change. We had a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse back to back this time. I'm like, okay, so so I started off by drawing and explaining what the lunar eclipse is and the solar eclipse is, and then I came to climate change. So that is where awareness has to start, and we have a lot of work to do. Since most of you have already said, we need to start study circles and raise awareness. I think building modules, building awareness raising materials, it could be different kinds of things, but that is where the power lies. Once people are equipped with both legal knowledge and scientific knowledge, they will be able to take care of themselves. Yeah, I would like to stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bhargavi. That's a beautiful note to end our second round of comments with. And we thankfully have about 15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. So kudos to everyone for supporting in that happening. I noticed, John, you had your hand up. If you're still in the room, you could perhaps unmute and briefly share your invitation with the gathering here.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes, you are audible. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here in South Durban, South Africa. I work with Patrick Bond. I'm sure you've all heard of Patrick Bond. With a project, the G20 from Below project, that was set up, with the G20 in South Africa this year. The idea is to publicize and coordinate worker and community struggles in the G20 countries. I've provided the links for the two websites and the Facebook earlier. I will repost them. I'm just wondering, what's going to happen at the G20 is going to be in India next year. What's been planned as far as protests and other things around it?
Thanks, John. So that's an open invitation and query. With the G20 plan for India next year, what's being planned around it? And if anyone in the room, including our panelists, has something to offer on that, both the chat and verbal comments are welcome. I also want to perhaps just draw the attention of a small conversation that's happened in the chat. Ashish, if you're still in the room, you're welcome to unmute and just maybe raise your question. Not sure if he's still around. No, I think the question Ashish raised, which was directed at you, Prakash, was is there not a fourth kind of power of civil society movements that is showing actual practical climate solutions on the ground, including resisting actions that increase emissions and constructive alternatives like climate-friendly food sovereignty? And Vandana has added a comment there. Vandana, you're in the room. You want to maybe just share what came up in your comment about the creativity that comes from a different paradigm?
Yeah, I was just wondering just how it might, relate to what both Ashish said and what Prakash said, that, if working from a different paradigm itself than, the way we are taught to think in modern industrialized, globalized cultures, is that kind of creativity, is that what you mean when you talk about narrative power, given that narratives shore up or work against paradigms? It's just curious.
Thanks, Vandana. So, Prakash, maybe a brief response to those two questions/comments.
Right. So to start with the simpler question of civil society power, yes, I mean, the whole goal is to bring power to social movements and civil society. But thinking about different forms of power and different strategies of power at different levels, global, national, subnational, that's the part of the power matrix that I mentioned. And for those who joined late, there's an article on the Google Doc that I posted in the chat to talk about different forms of power. And to Vandana's question, yes, absolutely. We have seen contestation of this dominant form of capitalist approaches to thinking about. And by the way, Marxism was founded on an understanding of capitalism in certain ways. So there's a lot of discussion that we need to have about what those underlying assumptions are and how do we move past those to inform the kind of praxis that we need in today's time, where you have authoritarian governments taking over institutions of the state, and sometimes even, of course, taking over the institutions of civil society. So maybe we can have a separate webinar around just that topic itself.
Thanks so much, Prakash. And I think Vandana had another question, which I'm going to just combine with a question from Saroj. So Vandana's question was, a separate question was, what kinds of awareness building materials and approaches already exist that have worked in different contexts, especially among marginalized groups? What kind of awareness building materials and approaches that already exist? And I think Saroj had a broader question, which is something that all of us are concerned about, of course, which is in the current climate injustice. Maybe, Saroj, are you in the room? Would you like to express your question in your own voice? I see you're in the room, so if you can unmute, you're welcome to just ask it out. Okay, maybe I can just share it. In the current climate injustice being carried out by the government that we are experiencing in various parts of India, from Andamans to Aravalis to Singrauli, what practicable options do we have to protect the forest and forest dwellers, right? And so I think at the heart of both of these queries is what works, what good examples do we have that we can learn from and perhaps broaden. And Bhargavi already touched upon that in her closing comments, which was like, let's go local and really invest in the power of the local. But it's open to all four of you in case you have notes on what should we do in the current context, what actually works, any examples for what is working well. And since we've just heard from Bhargavi and Prakash, maybe I'll invite either Disha or Nagraj to offer something here.
I mean, very briefly, I mean, I would think that central to addressing that is the struggles around the forest rights side, and particularly around the collective control and ownership of the forest, not individual but also collective. And as we know, the act itself came out of such an inspiring campaign and struggle. But then after that, after its enactment, the struggle has essentially been on its sort of adequate and democratic implementation, which has simply deeply been inadequate. And on the contrary, the government has then been opening out the forests in different ways to industry, to extractive industries, to certain kind of corridors in the name of defense and so on near the borders, and other kind of ways in which I think community and people's rights with the forests are in different ways being undermined. So I think somewhere the core in sense is that struggle around collective rights on the forest and the FRA, in which I think there needs to be again support for the groups and organizations that are actively engaged with forest movements and forest workers and forest dwellers. Uh, my slightly understanding is that they were sort of more together sort of 10 or 15 years ago, but since then they've been again, as movements happen, they've been not so together as, and I think there is a question of concern, but that's one entire arena I think that needs our support. The second part I think that needs a support not specific to forest, but more broadly to sort of rural and agrarian areas more specifically is this entire issue of the NREGA. I think it's just massive what has happened. This attack on the NREGA is just massive. Given the enormity, given the scale and number of people who depend on the NREGA, I think all of us in the climate movement need to be aligning with those who work on NREGA unions, workers unions, etc., or anyone else who campaign around energy to try to ensure there's no dilution. And in fact, there should be an expansion because of the fact essentially that it kind of overlaps with climate concerns, with climate adaptation, with the impacts of climate on the poorest in different areas. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Nagraj. We have a hand up with the Suhasta here. Before we go to Suhast, Disha, anything you want to add on this point of what is actually working, or where can we find hope and sustenance in the current climate?
Yeah, I think adding to what Nagraj said, Yeah, when we do work with unions, like in Bangalore, I think a lot of our successful campaigns have been when there's been cross-movement collaboration, because I don't think any of us live single issue lives. And in the same way, the work we do shouldn't be single issue. So when we do collaborate with unions, when we do collaborate with other movements, we've seen results. And I think one of my favorite examples of this was during the EIA, when we worked with different environmental communities, different like forest dwelling communities, and like unions and um, even like workers unions across the country. And we managed to mobilize, like, I believe, like 20 lakh people to send oppositions to like the amendments made to the EIA back in 2020. I think for me that was the biggest I had seen of people coming together and working so well. And I always hold on to that story and hold on to that hope, especially because it happened in the middle of a pandemic when none of us could go out. And I think if we can do that then, we can do so much more now. And I think that's something that I hold on to for hope as well. Yeah.
Super. Thank you so much. Yes, I remember that groundswell of opposition to the proposed EIA amendments, and I too was impressed at how large the turnout was. It also reminds me of back in 2005, 2006. Bhargavi, you will know about the MOEF Cello and the issuing of the death certificate to the ministry, right? So really creative examples, even from the last 20, 25 years. Suhastai, please, over to you. You can unmute and speak. You've had your hand up patiently for a while.
Thanks a lot. Happy to have so many young people around, because all our, not all, but the experienced movements have always been for environmental issues. So there is a direct connection between the future of the youth, which is addressing the climate crisis, and the goals that the experienced movements have. So I would invite all enthusiastic youth concerned with climate to come and stay in the villages who are fighting, or the urban areas, like Disha has shared the experience in the unions in Bangalore. So you're most welcome to be with us. What the grassroots people need, they have some kind of perceptions, but what they need is, one, clarification about the various greenwash jargons which are used, like giving money for uh, in exchange of their land, which are not giving enough produce, uh, just a peanut money to have a corporate company have monocultures there. So these kind of demystifications are needed. Another thing which probably Sujay could have said better is having some kind of workshops with the people, which were organized by NACEJ with Soumya Datta and uh, those, to have the local people know the techniques by which they can monitor what is happening to their climate, by like monitoring the wet bulb heat and dry bulb temperatures, humidity, and have the data to demand that the climate change is affecting their lives. Another thing I would say is health impacts are the easiest for all across the social communities, rural, urban, and all kinds of struggle. So that is why we have been using health as an issue uh, to show, I mean, to make people realize how the climate change is directly affecting their lives, and how the climate change is an outcome of the political motives and the kind of development model that is being imposed on us. So the youth helping to understand for themselves all these intersectoral connections, like Prakash was saying, to make the communities realize that what they are suffering is because of denial of their rights, the denial of their constitutional rights.
Thank you,
So
Suhastai.
we
Those are
welcome
great.
you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very
Just,
valuable.
just a small point. Another thing, what I would like is the waste to energy plants, which are again for the corporate interest but imposed on people, especially in big cities, again to the marginalized people. They are causing a lot of havoc. And what the kind of help I would like someone to give is to have the economics of those plants, the extent of energy that is used to even erect the plant and run the plant, and what they are doing hazardous thing to climate and health.
Thank you.
So
Noted.
if
And I
anybody
think
is interested, I do want help for that. Thank you so much. Bye.
definitely. Thank you very much, Suhastai. And thank you for raising the waste to energy issue and the way in which it's being promoted, running roughshod on many local ecological and other human rights related concerns. That was a topic on which NACEJ had a webinar very recently as well. So we are out of time. We have two more questions in the chat box that we will not get to today, but I invite you to just read them. I think Tejaswi is just prompting us to think about, if we go ahead with these study groups, how are they going to be different from what has already been there? What's really going to bring in this kind of space that we've tried to, albeit in a very, very uh, introductory way, explore the movement core of climate justice interests in India? How can we promote that through these study groups? And Subhashri has asked us to think about what forms of action are possible when vulnerable communities are already politically aligned with the ruling party because they are in some ways dependent on welfare benefits, right? And how does one work in that context to create awareness, agency, without sort of triggering fear that those welfare benefits or safety nets might be lost? I also want to remind us of John's prompt from earlier, G20 in India, what might we do? How might we respond to it? Prakash, I'm sorry that we haven't had enough time for your last comment. Is it something that could be done in a very, very telegraphic way as a closing note?
Sure. Yeah. And, I wanted to quickly follow up on Bhargavi's point about local government-based microgrid planning and implementation. We have to build a movement around that, because what we have seen in the US is that as these micro solutions expand, you'll have those macro players come swooping in again. And so building of movement is necessary not only just for building the infrastructure, but also protecting it against attacks that will come later on. So thank you for that important point.
Super. Thank you so much. Bhargavi, any last note from you, or are we, you want to say something? Go for it. We have time for like.
No, I've just put two articles in the chat box so everybody can read it.
Super. Thank you. And in that spirit, we will have some materials that come out of this event, including a lot of beautiful resources that have been saved in chat. And we do hope to continue this conversation and translate it into even more diversified sets of offerings for collaborative work. So please stay connected. This is just an initial salvo, we hope, to galvanize many such introspective but also impactful organizations around the climate justice movement in India. Thank you, everyone, for a very precious commitment of your time during a very busy time in the year. Holiday greetings and take care of yourself until we meet next time. Stay well and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.